Here we go. Well, I am really excited about this inaugural episode of Spiritual Life and Leadership in partnership with Fuller Seminary's Church Leadership Institute. And so Tod Bolsinger and I are going to have a conversation today. Hi, Tod. Welcome. How are you doing?
Hey, Marcus. Nice to be back on your show again. I think this is the fourth time that I've
I
been
know.
on Spiritual Life and Leadership.
You're my favorite guest. You hold the record.
Yeah.
So let me just say a brief word of introduction about you again. So you're the author of two great books, Canoeing the Mountains and Tempered Resilience. Tempered Resilience just came out at the end of last year, I think, and fantastic book about really kind of about probably some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. But let me just give you a second to introduce yourself and what you do and whatever else you want to tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so it's very fun to be on this podcast with you. You've done such a great job. This is your inaugural podcast with us, but I think you've done like over 100, right?
This is episode 100. Yep.
Yeah.
So what a great episode 100.
Yeah, it's a great moment. So for us, this is really significant. So one of the things that's happened at Fuller Seminary, I've been there for the last 7 years. For the first 6.5 years, I was a vice president, and I was part of the senior leadership team that was really trying to bring about the significant kinds of changes that are needed in theological education. And it's been a huge privilege of my life. And when we finally got our strategic planning process finished and we launched what we're now calling Fuller Next, I went to our president and said, look, you're going to need someone who wants to manage and administrate this. And I actually have a burden now even more for the way in which the church needs to change. And so because I'd been spending the last 5 years traveling around the country, talking with church leaders of really vastly, broadly diverse denominations and backgrounds about the need for strong, faithful change leadership, we suggested the idea of creating the Church Leadership Institute as part of our Dupree Center for really focusing on helping church leaders faithfully navigate change. And so they invited me to stay on at the school into this role. And it's just my gift. I wake up every morning thinking about how we can really serve people who are right in the middle of the crucible of leading change in a disruptive world. And one of the things that we thought about after a few months is we needed a place where we can have conversations with people about their own spiritual life and with leaders about that, about the way in which they need to continually be formed spiritually to lead change. And so you and I started talking, and now we have this great resource. We get to bring people your podcast to leaders about the spiritual life they need to be able to lead change. And we're thrilled to be in the middle of that.
Oh, me too. So Church Leadership Institute is brand new. I mean, this is not an existing thing. This is, and how long has it been in existence then officially?
Well, in September, we started the work, and we basically rolled it out officially in January. So it is brand new. It is my third startup at Fuller Seminary since I've been there. Fuller is the kind of place that allows me to be has allowed me and a lot of us to be really creative about coming up with ways in which we can serve the church. And so we're really at the beginning, and we're beginning to have just lots and lots of opportunities to serve leaders. So
yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Well, I'm super excited. So let's talk about leadership then today. This is sort of a preview, I guess, of all the many kinds of things, or broadly speaking, the kinds of things that we'll be talking about, really continue to be talking about on this podcast. I don't think that we're really changing a whole lot. Now we're doing it together. So let me just ask you this question. What are some of the things that you think leaders need to develop for this world that we're living in now? What do leaders, what do pastors and others need for this time?
Well, one of the most powerful things that's happened, and it's certainly been made clear during the pandemic, is that most of us who are trained to be church leaders were actually trained to be teachers and chaplains. Like, we do pastoral care, we teach, we preach, we lead worship, but nobody ever really taught us how to be organizational change leaders. How do you take a community of people and help them be faithful to their deepest values, to the cause of the gospel, in a radically changing world that's going to require us to make really hard decisions? And
Hmm.
so the bulk of the work that I've been doing, that I did through my books, and now we're allowed to do in the Church Leadership Institute, is really focus on that. How do we help leaders be formed? It's a formation process. It's both a
Right.
spiritual formation and leadership formation, so that they can wisely navigate change. And
Yeah.
that process, what we've done is we're taking the entire set of resources that a seminary has, our research, the resources we can develop, coaching, consulting, lots of things that we can offer, and we make them available to leaders right where they are. And in many ways, this podcast is really a symbolic to us of the kind of generous, broad approach that we want. We want as
Mm.
many leaders as possible to be able to access the kind of resources that will help them be faithful to their calling, to their communities, and will help them personally thrive. We know that a lot of leaders have, especially during these last year with the pandemic, have really
Yeah.
experienced a lot of stress and a lot of struggle, and we want to be here to support them.
Yeah. Yeah. That's cool. Um, uh, I think one of the well, you mentioned formation, right? That in my experience, I think is at the heart of healthy leadership. Is how have we
Mm-hmm.
been formed as human beings? It's good to have all the best practices of leadership as well. I mean, that's all really important too. But if you're not a healthy spiritually formed person in your
Mm-hmm.
inner life, right? Your outer life is going to reflect that. And so I'd love to know from you. And by the way, I'm not technically interviewing you. We're going to have a conversation, but I'm used to being the interviewer. So here I go.
Mm-hmm.
Feel free to ask me anything you want to as well.
Yeah.
But tell us a little bit about how you've been formed as a leader.
Yeah, yeah. So it's interesting. So the most recent book I wrote, Tempered Resilience, came out of a conversation that I had with leaders around the country, and it went something like this. I was teaching about how to lead change and how to lead what's called adaptive change. It's when you have to learn to lead when you're no longer an expert, when you don't have best
Mm,
practices, when you can't rely on your old programs. Then literally you face this kind of gut wrenching moment where you realize, I don't have a perfect solution. I don't have a plan. I don't have a program. And I don't know if anybody does. So we're going to have to learn as we go.
yeah.
And the only thing we know is we're going to probably also have to face loss. There's a
Yeah.
lot of stuff we're going to have to drop. Things we're going to have to give up to move forward. And that's
Mm,
really hard. And one of the key principles of Ronald Heifetz is that people don't resist change. They resist loss.
yeah.
So what's been really formative in my own life has been my ability to be with really wise mentors who helped give me both the courage and the conviction to be
Hmm.
clear about what it means to live out the gospel when you're going to be facing loss.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, loss, right? Yeah, loss. I love asking people about, why do people resist loss? I've got a little Facebook group, and I asked the members of this group, why do people resist change? That's the question. Why do they resist change, right? And it's not really about change; it's about loss. And
Yeah.
as you're talking about uh, leading when you're not an expert, I mean, we're coming out of a year of COVID right now, and that this has every single person, that's their experience. There have been no
Yeah.
experts during this COVID time. It's almost like it leveled the playing field in some regard in terms of our experience. Oh, this is what it's like to lead when you have no idea what to do.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
um
Yeah. Yeah. And Marcus, you've talked to a lot of these folks. What if
mhm.
the folks the interviews you've had with people that have just been lingering, right? They're the ones people
Yeah.
click on, they come back to, that you find yourself thinking about. What are the common experiences of those kinds of leaders? These folks who know they can't be experts, but they've got to keep leading anyway. What have you experienced about
Right.
that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the common theme, uh, it's not always the same word that they use, but it's the same idea, and it would be surrender.
Mm,
Um, Meaning, I think, and this has been my own experience too. I think healthy leadership involves surrender, which is countercultural in some ways
yeah.
because we live in a never surrender kind of a culture. Never surrender, right?
Hmm.
Um, uh, but I think in order to lead especially in a context in which you don't know what you're doing, or you don't know what the future holds, you don't know what's the next right step to take, right? It's just surrendering first of all to God, right, and just acknowledging that you don't you don't have the expertise required for this journey. Um, and then surrendering to the reality of the situation, right? One of the things that I've seen, I'm just thinking about this year of COVID, there's been a lot of trying to stay in control, right? And that might be, parents trying to get schools to open maybe too soon, or just trying to live life normally when you just it's not the right time for that, right? And trying to get back in control, kind of trying to get what we had before. And I think just thinking about this past year, surrendering to the reality of this COVID world we've been living in has been important. So those are the kinds of things that I've heard from guests as well. Some of the standout episodes have been around issues of emotional health, like Chuck DeGroat's episode on narcissism in the church, right? And that has to do with surrender and control, right? When a leader leads from a place of self-focus narcissistically, right? That's a lack of surrender. So anyway, right, I think for me and for many that I've spoken with, that has been sort of the underlying theme is, if we're going to lead in a healthy way, we need to lead from a place of surrender rather than from a place of, I know what I'm doing and I'm going to get it done. There can be a little bit of that, but it has to be all.
And this is interesting. Yeah, this is interesting because this is a lot of what we do when we coach people through these processes. People come on. So a lot of what we do at the Church Leadership Institute is we offer resources like this, like lots and lots of resources, podcasts and articles and videos and such that are just free, and that we make it as available as we possibly can. And then people want to take a deeper dive with us, and they can step into one of our courses where we teach people through some of these different formation practices and leadership practices. And then sometimes they walk into coaching with us. And very often the coaching process is really coaching people to give up the expert expectation and lead the learning. And the verse I often use is a verse of surrender. It's John chapter 12. If a seed falls to the earth and dies, it bears much fruit.
Yes.
But if it doesn't, it remains a single grain. And I often say to leaders, the hard part of this moment is you are having to lead your entire congregation into a process of fruitful surrender, fruitful death, fruitful loss. Like, what are you willing to give up or change or let go of so that the fruit of the gospel can be seen in your neighborhood? And it's painful and it's difficult. And it's one of the reasons why we accompany people. Like in Tempered Resilience, I talk about the fact that you need a lot of relationships to walk with you through the process of leading change. And that one of the parts that I think we all need is someone to help hold us when we feel vulnerable about surrender.
Yeah. I love the image of a seed dying and coming to life. There's something, I'll get theological for a moment, but that's the spiritual life is death and resurrection, right? And you can't experience resurrection if you don't die in some way first, right? And that's, again, connected to surrender. I have to surrender to whatever it is that I need to die to, and that's the lost part, right? So that then something new can come. We don't know what resurrection looks like on the other side. Maybe Jesus did. Maybe he knew exactly what it was going to look like. Certainly God the Father did, I would say. But the disciples didn't. I mean, they didn't even know it was coming, right? But they had, in order, and I think that they experienced a kind of resurrection with Jesus when that happened, right? Life from death, right? And that's the kind of formative thing I think that I have found to be life-giving, even though hard in the moment, right? This COVID, I'm just thinking, again, our context is COVID. It's been really hard. It's been a year of death, literally, and also just in terms, and spiritually, in some ways, emotionally, right? And I was just, kind of came from a meeting with some other pastors talking about COVID fatigue, that we're all going through right now. And But the hope is life, right? That there is life if we
Yeah.
can in some way surrender to whatever it is that we're being invited to die to. Yeah.
Yep. When I think about this notion of surrender, I think about how a seed has to fall to the earth, fall to the ground. And
Mm-hmm.
so one of the parts we
Mm.
often do when we're coaching people or we're working with them through this process is we say, the most important thing you can have as a leader is to be grounded in something
Mm.
other than your success in leading change.
Mm-hmm.
Like this is one of those
Mm.
great ironies, right? Like whoever wants to keep his life must lose it,
Yeah.
right? Right.
Yeah.
So if you want to be part of faithfully leading your church, your congregation, your organization through change, you have to be grounded in something other than your success at leading change. And
Yeah.
that notion, we see this in the life of Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Before Jesus preaches a sermon, before he does a miracle, before he casts out a demon, before he confronts a power, he hears a voice say, "You are my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased."
Yes.
And to
Yeah.
know that God loves us, is pleased with us. The Eugene
Mm-hmm.
Peterson translation is, "You are the pride of my life." Don't you love that,
Mm-hmm.
right, phrase? To
Yeah.
know that before we've done anything, we are already the pride of God's life is really necessary for leaders. And one of the reasons why we want this podcast is because we want to keep introducing leaders who are in the middle of the trial to
Mm-hmm.
others who are walking alongside them in conversation. They feel like they can
Yeah.
hear those voices, they can be encouraged, they can learn some things,
Yeah.
and really be more deeply formed throughout the
Yeah.
whole process, right?
Yeah. Um, uh, I love that you touched on the idea of success.
Mm-hmm.
I think the metric for success is changing. It
Yeah.
has to, I think. The metric for success has always been how many people show up on Sunday morning. And we haven't had people show up on Sunday morning for a year now, right?
Right,
And
right.
so there's a totally different. Now, maybe we count views on YouTube or whatever, but I think more and more of us are recognizing that that's not the primary metric, right? And so, well, let me just ask it as a question: what do you think is what are we looking for in terms of success in as we lead change and as we lead as God leads us?
Yeah. So when I defined leadership, I defined it as energizing a community of people toward their own transformation in
Mm,
order to participate in God's mission in the world. Right. So,
yeah,
so we need
yeah,
to be transformed for the mission that God has given us.
yeah,
And that's everybody. That's like, so the job of the leader of the community is not to be the sole transformation person. It's to lead and energize a community of people toward transformation. So more and more and more, I think the questions we're going to have to think about in terms of marks of success, maybe that rather than metrics, is what are the metrics of the transformed life? What does it look
mm,
like to be
hmm,
to have more of our people more deeply connected to each other and more deeply connected to the mission of God in the world?
mm,
What does it mean? How might we measure that our community is actually known, that our church is known in our community for being something that brings value and life and joy and peace?
yeah,
I worked with a church in New Zealand, and this was their mission statement. It was to make our neighborhood a better place to live.
yeah.
They said,
I love it.
wasn't that great? I said to them,
Yeah.
so tell me where you get that mission statement. They said, well, they happened to be in an urban neighborhood that was right outside the city of Auckland. And they said, our neighborhood is just a bunch of apartments where people barely knew each other. They're the kinds of people who took these apartments because they couldn't afford to live in a better neighborhood closer to their work. So
Mm,
everybody just gets on the bus or gets off the bus and they barely know each other. We planted a church in this neighborhood for the purpose of saying this neighborhood needs to be a good place to live.
yeah,
And what they just did is they just made this neighborhood come alive with
yeah,
street fairs and connections and opportunities of service and neighborliness and love. Like their mission was to enliven this part of the
yeah,
city that people
yeah.
felt disconnected to. And I think, so how do you measure that? Well, you measure that
Right.
in the joy of people who
Mm,
stay more connected, people who,
yeah.
decide not to sell out of their apartment and move because they want to have a deeper sense of community.
Mm,
And I think part of what's going to come out of this year, this year where we had not only a health crisis, but an economic
mhm.
crisis, a
Yeah.
growing, deepening awareness of racial injustice that was, so
Right.
for some of us, was below the surface, and others of us they lived with every day.
Yeah.
Like that we need our churches to be places that to be communities that make our neighborhoods and our cities better, more joyful communities of life.
Yeah.
And it's going to take a different kind of leadership to do that.
Yeah. And so that also, you mentioned the mission of God. I'll share what I think about as the mission of God. You can tell me what you think then too. When I think of the mission of God, and the church you described, I think perfectly captures, in my opinion, the mission of God. When I think of the mission of God, it's the restoration of shalom in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Shalom being a comprehensive state of well-being that touches every aspect of life, right? And so it's our spiritual life, of course. And so salvation, right? Reconciliation with God is part of the shalom that God wants for us, but also reconciliation with each other, reconciliation with the created order, reconciliation with our own inner selves, so to speak, right? A healthy emotional life, inner life, spiritual life. So restoration of shalom and all these things, what I heard in terms of that church is, here's the restoration of shalom that God has called us to specifically, this neighborhood, making this, restoring shalom in this neighborhood, right? And that's a different
Mm-hmm.
metric too, right? It's not
Right.
butts in the seats, as they say. It's not
Right.
how big is
Right.
your budget? It's not right. It's about bringing healing and wholeness to the world. So that's when I think of the mission of God. That's what I think of the mission. How would you maybe characterize it? What do you think?
Yeah, really similarly. The verse for me is, the prayer right out of the Sermon on the Mount. Your kingdom come, your will be done
Mm,
on earth.
yeah.
And I mean that should be a really particular place on earth. Like the place, I
Mm,
always say that wherever my feet are landed, wherever I am planted roots, wherever God has called us to be there, whether it's an exile like you have in Jeremiah, right?
yeah.
Build houses, plant vineyards,
Yeah.
bless this city so that,
Yeah.
this bring peace to this city, or wherever we have been called. And what I think most people miss when we're talking about leadership is they often
Hmm.
think leadership is a bunch of techniques just to make the church bigger or grow your budget.
Right.
And we're not talking about that at all. We're
Right.
talking about having your church be transformed into a place where your neighborhood blesses you. Where I used to have this imagery when I was pastoring a church in Southern California. I used to say that there was always this threat that that California was going to widen the freeway, the I-5, because of the traffic. And if they did,
Mm.
they
Hmm.
literally would take our church by eminent domain. And I said, our goal is to make our church such a part of this community that if they ever wanted to widen the freeway at our church and take it by eminent domain, 10,000 people who don't go to our church would line the streets and protest,
Hmm.
because they would
Wow.
say, oh my gosh, this community of people and where their house of worship, their home, is really so critical to this community, even for those of us who don't go there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when we're talking about the kind of leadership we're talking about this deep, pervasive leadership that's going to require a lot of our churches to change from kind of an internal, hey, we give religious services to whoever shows up, we just try to grow our budgets and our programs, to an external missional approach to impacting the world around us.
Yeah.
And that's hard work. It's beautiful,
Hmm.
inspiring work, but it's hard
Yeah.
work. And
Yeah.
for most leaders, it requires them to have a kind of depth of spiritual life and a depth of emotional health, as you've talked about very often,
Right.
that
Yeah.
we're going to need to make sure that we're always attending to.
Right. Right. Because again, you're letting go of something that maybe you've
Yeah.
held dear in the past.
Mm-hmm.
I'll reflect a little bit. The church that I'm serving right now is a tiny little church in rural Southern California, farmland, Imperial County, Westmoreland Community Presbyterian Church. And I love talking about them because so I guest preached there for about a year, about once or twice a month prior to becoming their interim pastor. And I met with their elders a few times, and I asked them, you've got a nice campus. It's small, but it's a nice, clean campus, and they got a nice fellowship hall and a kitchen. And I said, "What do you guys do besides church on Sunday mornings?" And they kind of looked at each other and said, "Oh, yeah, nothing really." And I said, "Well, what else could you do? I'm sure there's something." So anyway, so that got their wheels turning, and they tried a few things, a health fair. some other things, and then they tried a food pantry near the end of that year, and they started it just before. So I'm not taking any credit, other than maybe asking a good question. But they started this food pantry, and it started by serving 50 people. There's 800 families in this town, so it's a tiny little town. 50 families, then 75, then 100, and then the pandemic hit. Now it's 175 to 200. 25% of the town comes and gets, because there's a lot of food insecurity in this town, right? And that's, I always tell them, and there's 25 people in church on Sundays these days, maybe 35 pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
We had a Sunday where there were 11 people in addition to me and the two music people about a month ago. And I said, hey, that's okay, because you know what? We just served 200 families on Thursday night. And that's the mission of God. Worship is important too, and it's a joy to be together, but other people have stuff going on. That's okay this morning, but we are fulfilled, and that ministry has brought so much energy to this church, so that it feels like even Sunday mornings are not necessarily more people, but more life in the worship. And I feel so blessed to get to be a part of what God is doing in that little church at this time. Yeah.
Well, part of what I love about that story, it's two things, and it's one of the reasons why we're doing this podcast together. One is you're not just a podcaster, you're not a journalist who's an interviewer, you're a pastor. So you're talking to people who are your colleagues in ministry, like you're on the front line. I was a pastor for 27 years, but for the last 7 years, I've been in the seminary. So I've been behind the scenes. Now, most of my work is actually in coaching and consulting and speaking and writing. You're on the front lines, actually leading a congregation. Every single thing you learn from one of your guests, you put into practice, and single thing you try, it influences and informs your questions, which is so life-giving. I love that part.
Yeah.
And the other part I love about it is this phrase you use, which is they tried a few things. And here's a really interesting thing we've learned about people going through change, and especially resilient leaders going through change. They create a community of experimentation. This is one of the maxims we often talk about when we coach. We tell people, don't try to predict the future. Don't try to predict what's coming. Strategic planning is not about predicting. It comes through prototyping. Don't predict, prototype. We learned this from our friends in Silicon Valley, who told us, a prototype is a small experiment, a safe, modest, cheap experiment that you can then learn from. And the emphasis isn't, hey, did it work? The emphasis is, what did we learn? And so one of the things your community learned is, with a relatively small church, you can bless a lot of people.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh,
amazing.
Don't you wish that churches all over the country could learn that?
Right.
We don't have to be big to bless people. We just have to be willing to give our lives away, to get in service and care and faithfulness.
That's right.
And everybody needs to learn from that, right?
Yeah.
We don't need to just learn from the large, famous churches. We need to learn from every church.
That's right.
So don't predict, prototype. Lead the learning, and we're all gonna be much more fruitful on the back end.
Yeah. I love that. Don't predict, prototype, and that's the kind of stuff that people are going to continue to learn through Church Leadership Institute. I assume, right? Those are all these things that we've talked about. This is the kind of stuff that Church Leadership Institute is going to be focusing on. So why don't we kind of draw to a close here? But tell us a little bit maybe about some of the resources that Church Leadership Institute is going to be offering.
Yeah. So what we offer right now are basically kind of 4 buckets. We not only do we offer these free resources, but we offer classes. We offer courses for people. We've got one coming up in May that we'll tell you about in a second. We offer coaching for leaders who want to go through a process of having someone walk with them through some of the processes of change to learn these things in a more in-depth way. We offer a cohort. We have cohorts. Right now we have 20 churches from across the country who are going through an 18-month experience with their teams. So a cohort is for your leadership team, lay and professional staff, to learn how to lead change. in that. And then we sometimes do whole church consulting. We take them through a change process, or we take them through a transition, and so we do that. So courses and coaching and cohorts and consulting. And what it means is that in every way, we're trying to find as many resources and ways as possible of supporting and shaping leaders for the change process in this really disruptive world. And as we've go through this, so this is the Church Leadership Institute is entirely given over to that, and it enables us to be able to do so.
That's awesome. And if someone wanted to engage, what could they do? Where can they go?
Well, so our website is depree.org, DEPREE.org, depree.org/church. And so depree.org/church. But here's the little thing. We've got some really creative people on our team. They created this thing. If you just text the word change, like we're changing the church, we're leading change, text the word change to 66866. You'll get on our mailing list. We'll send you a bunch of free stuff. We'll tell you some opportunities that have got coming up right away. So like the course we have coming up in May. So.
Awesome. Text change to 66866. That's awesome. How easy. Right. There's some trying something new and learning to adapt to the world, technology and all that. Okay, good. Hey, thanks, Todd. This has been awesome. And I'm really excited about CLI, Church Leadership Institute. I'm really excited that I get to be a part of it through this podcast and to continue to work with you and learn and grow myself as we do this. So thanks for everything that you're doing. And I'm really grateful for you.
Yeah. And Marcus, thanks for joining us. It's a great, great privilege for us to have your resource, your conversations, and your wisdom and experience with us on our team. We're thrilled.
And we'll cut right there. That's great. Hey, I think that went really well.
Yeah, good. Good.